Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here today to review Hubie Halloween. Hubie Halloween. I'm probably going to mispronounce that because that's just who I am. Ultimately, this is an Adam Sandler film that is currently on Netflix, making the rotation right now. At the end of the day, we are going to go into this movie and talk about it at first in a very cryptic-like way. Then eventually I'm going to give you a double 5 timed spoiler count. And then ultimately, after that amount of time, we're going to go into spoilers about this movie. So, reasonably, if anything, if you're not an Adam Sandler fan, maybe you might like this movie because a lot of times Adam Sandler is just getting pelted with stuff throughout a bulk of this movie, or a lot of times he is shown to be the town pariah where everyone hates him. So ultimately, if you're not an Adam Sandler fan, this movie is probably for you. Going into this movie, it feels like this movie was a lot of fun to make. You can tell the entire cast was honestly having fun making this movie. Going into this, it looks like everybody had a really fun time. Everybody was just enamored about doing this project because why not? It's an Adam Sandler film. Every one of these things are usually kind of just fun, or people are just kind of spitballing and coming up with ideas off the top of their head normally. So going into this movie, the good thing about this movie is it seems like the entire cast are having fun. To also, on the other side, be brutally honest about this film, it honestly feels like a lot of the lines were honestly and truly improvised throughout this entire film. It seems like everything that was going on was like, okay, we have this and this and this and this going on in the film. And so in between those things, just randomly come up with anything within this, within here. And then we'll kind of just, finish this movie up in the editing bay. I realistically do not think, because Adam Sandler is known for doing this because Rob Schneider had done an interview at some point, an interview mentioning how Adam Sandler's process is when doing a movie. A lot of the times, basically, Adam Sandler usually calls up a number of his buddies, a number of his friends, and ultimately tells him, "Hey, yeah, we don't have a role for you in this movie, but just come with it. Just come with us anyways, and we'll figure something out when we get on set." And I think reasonably, especially within this movie, basically, I think Adam Sandler called every single one of his friends and said, "Yeah, I don't know what we're gonna do in this movie, but hey, just come all in. We'll just keep casting people because Netflix money." I think with really this movie, you can really tell that this movie was, in all actuality, just hey, get all my friends that I know, call them up and say, hey, let's do a movie together. And realistically, it's it's really not. This one kind of feels like they were kind of planning this movie as it was going on, or it seems like there were some characters that really seemed to not really have much actually going on in this movie, and it seemed like a lot of things were winging it through a bulk of this film. That's what it honestly and truly believes, or makes me believe in my head. So yeah, this movie could have came out any number of ways, and I'm sure realistically there was a number of times where there was a lot of different scenarios of which they were doing this movie. There was probably several different takes that they probably had. Admittedly, they have a whole entire montage of Adam Sandler going through 10 different takes of one scenario, coming back repetitiously to mention to the police force about some goofy crime that makes no sense. So going into this movie, like Adam Sandler basically plays as another like water boy esh like character in this movie, and reasonably a lot of the characters just kind of play like, well, like normally like there's certain people in this town, so ultimately, hey, like who would you want to play in this town? Yeah, I want to play the police officer. Go ahead. Oh, hey, I want to play the priest. Go ahead. I want to play the like I just want to play the couple that's making out in the movie in the drive-in. Go ahead, that's you. Like that is what this movie is, and then it just gets to the point where there's some roles where it's just like, yeah, I don't know what we're doing, and then it's just like, uh, well, hey, you used to do this role, right? Yeah. Well, how about you just be that? That's what this kind of like. Some people got some decent roles, and then a lot of people were either winging it or realistically just like randomly coming up with ideas that just kind of just didn't make sense, or eventually the story had to be wrapped up somehow, and so reasonably I feel like that may have been planned of how to wrap this whole thing up, because ultimately at the end of this it's a morality story, and ultimately I can appreciate it for that. I think probably when going into this movie, I think the catering audience is probably kids or just people that just like Adam Sandler films regardless. I don't think that this is like I don't think that this movie is like unwatchable by any. I don't think it's like horrible, but when looking at it, it doesn't feel. It really really crumbles and falls as it being like a movie that obviously has no plan. Um, and a lot of times they were just coming up with things off the plot, off the fly, and then ultimately people are just like, well, what the f are we gonna do now? I don't know, kill more time. I think this movie kind of either kills time or ultimately uh, is really just like, well, we didn't have a plan for this, so do this now. So, anyways, yeah, that's kind of just what I felt about this movie. It's fun, but when looking at it, it's just not like the tagline that is positioned onto this movie is fear dot less dot. Like I ultimately think that this movie should honestly take out the word fear and just put point dot less dot pointless. It's just I love I love some of the Adam Sandler films. I could enjoy what this movie was trying to do, but when looking at it, it's a shoved out there Netflix movie. That's what it comes out to be, honestly. So let's get into spoilers about this movie. At the end of the day, you can kind of get how my drift and how I feel about this movie. So let's go out of our way to ultimately spoil this movie. So now, like, there are some kind of like jokes, like, it's kind of funny. It's not like, ha ha ha. No, it's like, kind of fun. Like it's kind of funny at points, but a lot of it is just like you could tell it was an improvised movie, and people were thinking on their toes. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So Hubie Halloween. So we ultimately have it to where in the very beginning of this movie, Adam Sandler uh, is being greeted by his mother that is ultimately very well noticeably wearing a shirt that says boner donor, and so reasonably neither one of them know exactly what that means. And ultimately, the mother mentions that maybe it's some kind of mistake. And, or that maybe, like, boner means mistake. So ultimately, that's what she gets from that. So ultimately, like, we have Adam Sandler that is kind of playing this, like, not so quite in the know character, let's just say. And so immediately this character goes out, rides a bike everywhere he goes, and gets pelted with things. Ultimately, in the very beginning of this, he gets pelted with eggs. Ultimately, he uh, ends up catching the eggs in midair and putting it into his thermos. He drinks the eggs out of the thermos like Rocky does, and then quickly thereafter vomits it out. So we have we have Adam Sandler Ash's like character that is ultimately this town pariah. Nobody likes him. Everyone either pulls pranks on him or just treats him poorly and this and that. Because ultimately, we have Adam Sandler working at the deli, and ultimately, he's going through his normal day. Ray Liotta appears and ultimately tells him, "Hey, what's that? What's that sheep doing in your meat?" And Adam Sandler's like, "What are you talking about?" And then a giant sheep head appears out of the meat section and ultimately scares Adam Sandler. And he's like, "Oh my God!" And so, and basically through a bulk of this movie, we consistently are repetitiously showcasing the numerous times people appear out of nowhere to either grab Adam Sandler or something like that. It's always the running joke to have a montage of these things going on of Adam Sandler just really having to work for his money for this movie, because ultimately he is getting pranked and or pelted with food, or ultimately he is getting ribbed on by some person in the community. So ultimately, yeah, Adam Sandler gets freaked out by this, and this is the running joke. We ultimately have it later on when Ray Liotta is having his father's funeral right around Halloween, which is bizarre. And so, by and large, Ray Liotta ultimately sees Adam Sandler at this funeral. And what do you think he does? Especially if you've seen this movie. Ultimately, Ray Liotta is grieving about the loss of his father, and so Adam Sandler goes to comfort him, and Ray Liotta's character goes, "Well, you know what? Like I think it's in bad taste, but I think my father would appreciate this." And so ultimately, Ray Liotta dumps Adam Sandler into his father's grave with the coffin in there, mind you, and basically somebody starts like putting dirt into the grave, and then ultimately that person slips into the grave and falls on top of Adam Sandler. Ha 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 ha! It's a great joke. So ultimately, we have this character named, I think her name is Velvet. Ultimately, she is the woman that tends to adopt a lot of kids, and seemingly she is like very much like everybody loves her kind of person. It seems that like everyone is just like, "Oh my God, how many more kids are you gonna adopt?" Like it's kind of the running joke with them. But like every time that she sees a kid, she just is desperate to want to adopt them because she's just that good-hearted person. So we ultimately have this character named Velvet, who ultimately you would probably know from another Adam Sandler movie called Happy Gilmore, which ultimately uh, she plays the love interest in that movie. Which, what do you think happens in this movie? She kind of plays the love interest to Adam Sandler's character in this movie, and I thought that she was actually really good in the movie Joe Somebody, the Tim Allen movie. I really liked her in that. But I just kind of really liked that movie. It was kind of a very warm movie. It was pretty good. Plus, it's also done with the setting of Minnesota, which plus on that one. So going into this, yeah, I'm even going on tangents because that's how this movie just was kind of working for me, tangent wise. So we ultimately eventually get to the point to where uh, basically the real reason why Adam Sandler is the town pariah is because he basically goes and tells on everybody. He's like the tattleteller. He basically goes into the sheriff and the deputy's department. Ultimately, the sheriff is played by Kevin James, not Kevin Smith. Ultimately, I would probably easily make that confusion, but I'm trying to get characters and quasi actors' names correct via this review. So ultimately, a lot of people get Kevin James and Kevin Smith confused all the time. There's an entire joke about it on Jay and Silent Bob reboot. Like, there's a whole thing about that. So we have it to where Adam Sandler goes and tries to file a complaint with the sheriff, and Kevin James goes to Keenan, who's ultimately another Saturday Night Live uh, actor, and ultimately tells Kevin James tells Keenan, he's like, hey, like this guy, this package, like I thought you were gonna keep him out here or keep him away from me. It's like, well, sorry, sir, like he slipped by me, and so like they're talking about him as if he's not even there, and so ultimately Adam Sandler is trying to file a complaint, and so ultimately Kevin James breaks down how many numerous times that Adam Sandler's character throughout the years has come to this police station and filed numerous reports to absurdity degrees, where ultimately you have this gigantic montage of Adam Sandler continuously, repetitiously coming in there, looking different numerous times, and Adam Sandler comes in there and he says, like, hey, the grocery store is selling expired meat. Like, I think I saw somebody getting murdered, and like, and all this numerous stuff of all these false alarms and false accusations and repetitiously like all of these like untrue like statements. Like I think at some point he probably mentions like somebody gave me cooties. Like I'm sure he probably said that and this and that and all kinds of random nonsensical accusations. Um, because reasonably at some point, uh, Adam Sandler is at home and eventually he bumps into this. And I'm kind of jumping around through most of this movie. I'm probably not telling it exactly in order because there's some maybe good scenes than others in this movie. We ultimately have a neighbor that welcomes himself to the neighborhood to Adam and ultimately tells him, hey, like, I'm your neighbor Walter. Ultimately, hey, if you ever hear any strange sounds coming from my home, like, don't be worried about it. Just kind of treat it like it's no problem. And immediately, like, Adam's character is just like, oh, yeah, sure, whatever you want, whatever you... And then ultimately, later on in the movie, when he hears strange noises, because ultimately somebody mentions it, he goes in and tries to um, go into his house anyways, because ultimately he tells, like he's telling his neighbor when he's walking through his house, like, yeah, I know you were telling me not to come in here, but I came in here anyways, and so because I heard strange noises, and so ultimately we find out Walter is a character that bizarrely at night is consistently trying to transform into a werewolf, but it never actually happens. And to the point where this guy is repetitiously, consistently trying to transform all the time and eventually trying to lock himself up consistently. At some point, Rob Schneider comes in and plays a guy with just a sheep mask on and eventually is just kind of walking around the neighborhood and then eventually goes to And Rob Schneider is just a person that randomly pees on things throughout this movie. And then eventually he goes to find Walter's character and takes his sheep mask off and tells him, "Hey, we have to talk. We have to come clean." And so ultimately they turn themselves into the police department and ultimately tell the police department that they're escaped uh, crazy people that escaped from this insane asylum. It really has nothing to do with the ending story. It's just one part of this story. So at the end of the day, back to this police reporting business that Adam Sandler does. Ultimately, after this giant montage of, I know there's a lot of tangents going all the way back to this same story. So, Kevin Smith tells Adam Sandler's character, "Hey, like if you're wanting to desperately file a report, here's what you do. You ultimately write your report in some notebook, and you ultimately take this notebook and put it in the trash can of this exact location. And ultimately, we will pick it up for you, and we will definitely look into all of these reports." So, in other words, they're telling this guy a load of hoo ha so that way he never reports anything again. They're making him a special. They're telling him that he's in some special agency that they're kind of uh, tying themselves into, but they tell him never come back here again and report anything. Like if you mention it, we'll not know what you're talking about after this moment. So, so yeah, uh, that's what you do to if you ultimately want to file a report. Leave it in a notebook, and we'll pick it up at this specific location. So ultimately, we have all the people that are starting to go off trick or treating. It seems like Harley Quinn in this movie is a giant costume going on. Evidently, from whenever this movie was filmed, that was, I guess, the year where everybody had to be Harley Quinn. So this movie must have been done years ago and is now being plopped onto Netflix now. Or it seems like the Harley Quinn costume was probably the easiest to find a litany of, I guess, so, or the cheapest ones on eBay or whatever, so that's what they did. So, reasonably, going into this movie, we have a ton of people dressed up as Harley Quinn to the point where it makes no sense, but it is what it is. It's going into a movie that was like, it was going into a style that was like years ago, so anyways. Going into this movie, we have Adam Sandler, who is going into the school, ultimately dressed up as a ghost, and the ghost sheet has urine on it, and ultimately one of the kids has to notice it. So Adam yanks the sheet off of him, and ultimately he has a uh, piece of paper that says the word "boo" on it. And ultimately, he's kind of giving them a report about safety and all of this stuff about Halloween, and this and that. And so, because ultimately, he's going to be the Halloween monitor, or the neighborhood watch in a lot of other terms, within Halloween. Because he knows a lot of people are probably going to be doing some things that they're not supposed to. So, because eventually he ends up going to like some party and checking out that one of the kids that was actually supposed to be at home watching his sisters, he was actually out with a girlfriend. And funny enough, like the girls have to eventually mention like, "Hey, where is our brother? It seems like he's been gone for an alarming amount of time." And they're like, "Oh my god, he must have a girlfriend." Ah. So that's maybe the funny part of a movie where I'm like, God, this is kind of silly, stupid, but it is what it is. So eventually they have it to where Adam Sandler is getting pranked or punked by a number of people repetitiously. And to the point where eventually we get to where there's this couple in this drive in that ultimately is kind of hating on like Adam Sandler getting into everyone's business. So ultimately, they decide to pull a prank on him and ultimately mention, "Hey, there's some car that came here that's like been really creepy. Can you go and check him out? Cause yeah, like I'm kind of alarmed by this whole creepy car business." And so really, Adam eventually goes and checks them out for these people to eventually be taken later on. So because there's also a guy at this Halloween party that Adam Sandler was at earlier with the kid that ultimately was supposed to be looking and babysitting after his two sisters. There was another guy there that was dressed as Freddie Mercury that was going to prank Adam Sandler's character and ultimately tell like try to do some prank where he's some lost kid in this field, and so ultimately Adam goes and like hears like, "Hey, I'm so lost in this field," and so ultimately Adam goes out to look for him, and then the kid is like right next to him, and he's like, "Oh, I'm so lost," and so eventually the kid ends up getting nabbed by some mysterious assailant. So with all these people going gone, and eventually people are starting to get worried, and so immediately someone goes to the authorities to tell them like, hey, yeah, it seems like there's a lot of people missing. What's going on with here? So eventually, it just gets to the point to where ultimately the police and Adam are maybe assuming that it could be Velvet. And so ultimately, Adam eventually has to do this sting operation where he's wearing a wire and is going to Velvet, and the sheriff and the deputy are telling him, it's like, hey, like, if you get into any trouble, just say pumpkin. And so immediately Adam is talking to Velvet, and immediately he says pumpkin. And they're like, hey, he said it too early. Like, we're not going to get any information out of this girl to ultimately see like what's going on, or what's we're not going to get any information out. But eventually, Adam eventually confesses that he's like, you know what, like if I'm going to get taken or whatever, like you know what, I might as well confess that he had read the yearbook and and realized how beloved she was by like most successful, and all these notches were done on about her about the yearbook, and so eventually he tells her that like, I've always loved you, but if anything, I loved our teacher first, and that's why like I didn't think like it was our time, because ultimately like my feelings for you um weren't as strong as my feelings for our teacher. And so she's like, well, yeah, I guess it's just it's good that you're being honest. It's like, so cue it to where Adam's repetitiously saying pumpkin. It's like, do it now, pumpkin, help me, pumpkin. And so it just gets to the point to where like eventually they resolve this, I think, by the sheriff and the deputy just randomly walking in, and nothing really gets resolved. So eventually people continue to get nabbed up. I think like there was another call telling them that like people were getting nabbed up while Velvet was there. So um, maybe they were going with another person. I don't know. I don't remember exactly what happens to transition there, but it is what it is. So we get it to where eventually all these people end up getting nabbed, and we're all supposed to figure out who it all is. And so, reasonably, what ends up happening is that Adam Sandler's character ends up going home for the night, and ultimately he sees Michael Chiklis, which is the priest, ultimately hanging upside down. And then he goes further on into his house and realizes there's people all tied up by his home. We eventually find out that the snatching assailant is actually his mother the entire time. And reasonably, the reason why she nabbed up all these characters, so this is kind of like a Jason Voorhees kind of like Friday the 13th kind of scenario with the first movie, where ultimately it was the mother the whole time. She ultimately says, yeah, I nabbed all the people because reasonably you all were treating my son so horribly, so I thought I would kidnap you to teach you all a lesson. Because ultimately, Hubie would not fight back. Like, he's such a good moral person that ultimately he would not get even with you. So I decided, like, I would get even to finally teach you a lesson. And so ultimately, after everyone starts to get untied, and after this nice little speech the mother gives, it ends up to be where everyone starts to confess why they had all been so mean to Hubie. Because ultimately, the sheriff and deputy and the two insane guys appear to ultimately like stop the mother from doing what she's doing, and ultimately the two crazy guys are there because they were short on manpower. So ultimately they just brought in the two crazy guys in there to, of course, just wrap this movie up. But that's what it is. So we end up having it to where ultimately while everyone's getting tied up, they all start to confess why they tease Adam Sandler's character so much. Ultimately, we have Ray Liotta that mentions that he is actually dyslexic and he never really told anybody, and so he couldn't read that well. So ultimately, anytime Hubie would say any big words, like he hated him for that, and I'm like, what is this? And then ultimately, the couple that was in the drive-in ultimately mentioned, like, well, yeah, the reason why I pranked Hubie is because the woman in the couple's relationship isn't getting satisfied in the bedroom. So ultimately, looking at Hubie, it looks like Hubie doesn't need to be satisfied or having any bedroom business. So she takes it out on him because of that, and that's her reason. And like we go and go and go to the point where ultimately we have Kevin James that ultimately mentions that he was pulling somebody over once, and the person he pulled over called him a Muppet. And so he ultimately didn't do anything to the guy, but then eventually when he goes back into his car, like he really cried it out and had a good tear, and so that's why he rags on Huey because somebody called him a Muppet. All these excuses just like don't make any rational real sense, and one after the other it's so weird and or bizarre. And so ultimately, and there's one news report where ultimately Adam Sandler is confessing to Velvet on the news report that he loves her, and then he ultimately takes his lips in a kissing motion and kisses the camera screen, and all the while Velvet at home watching her TV, bizarrely at the same time, is taking her lips and smushing it up against the TV screen. And I'm just like, oh my god, this is like so goofy and so absurd. And so, cue us Halloween the next year. We have it to where Hubie is, I guess, even much more so with Velvet and or Violet, Violet, and so ultimately, it seems like him and Violet had gotten married because ultimately the kids are calling him dad, and so recently, as the kids all come out, every single one of the kids dress up this year as every one of their neighbors, to where one of the kids comes out as Kevin James's sheriff. We have one of the kids that comes out as Walter. We have one of the kids that comes out as like somebody else from the neighborhood. And so eventually, like, we have Kevin James that appears and ultimately is, of course, like going, oh hey, you're dressed up as this person, you're dressed up as this person, you're dressed up as this person. Then ultimately he looks at the person that is dressed up as him, and he's ultimately just like, oh, who are you dressed up as, a Muppet? And so reasonably, like, that is how the movie just kind of ends, with them just kind of eventually just going out and trick-or-treating. Like, there's a lot of times where Adam Sandler is just kind of riding his bike around and he's like, happy Halloween to all, and to all a good night. And like, that's just kind of how like the movie just eventually just ends, with Adam Sandler bizarrely just like repetitiously like uh telling people good night and Halloween, happy Halloween, and whatever, through a bulk of this movie. But it's it's a quasi bizarre movie to laugh at, because there's a lot of like, it's a lot of silly, stupid humor, but at the end of the day, there is some funny things that ultimately I think were heavily improvised and were just people having fun. And at the end of the day, that's what this movie really was. It was just a lot of actors just all doing a movie and having fun and not really caring how goofy they looked during this movie. And that's the best part of it. You had like uh, Tim Meadows from Saturday Night Live, who played this character that had like his head in his hands. And so ultimately, Tim Meadows would be licking the fingers of the fake hands and ultimately joking that the fingers are actually um, a metaphorical uh, like wangs or whatever. And like the woman that is with him is like, are you serious? Like, you are so stupid. So yeah, there's bizarre stuff like that. There's like jokes that I guess they were thinking would hope would land, or were just like, man, let's just try things and see what ultimately gets into the editing bay at the end of all this. So let's call this one a review. I'm sure there's probably some stuff that I ultimately kind of left out, or there's a lot of stuff that I rushed through. Uh, More than likely, yeah, when looking at this movie, there's not much going on anyways. Like, there's not much to really have to like, yeah, I really want to heavily dissect. So at the end of the day, I'm going to go out of my way to say goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.